What killed the BlackBerry? Well, in short, they fell behind and got outcompeted. And I'm saying they because I left RIM, or BlackBerry later, in 2007, and it really only became painfully obvious that they were outcompeted by 2010. And by that time, the mobile landscape had changed a lot, mostly because of Apple and Google, and the things that had made BlackBerry great were really no longer that important. But let's start with a bit of history and what made BlackBerry great. In late 1993, Mike Lazaridis, the co-CEO of RIM, although he was really the main guy in charge, made the bold decision to build our own Mobitex wireless modem module, which would be sold to other companies so they could integrate it into their products to add wireless functionality. We were ready to sell our modems by 1995, but the Mobitex wireless networks that it used were rather slow and far too expensive to use for just general internet web browsing, so it wasn't really something for consumers. It was for vertical markets, that is, custom applications that get high value out of relatively small amounts of data, because back then there really was no wireless data, so it was something like Mobitex or nothing. But if you're in the business of selling a part for others to integrate into their products, you have to wait for them to design it in, launch their products, and then hope that they sell lots of products so you can sell to them. So in 1995, RIM set out to build their own integrated messaging device with a flip-open screen and integrated keyboard, and by April of 1996, that was demonstrated to ram mobile data. And that was a significant thing and also a major scene in the BlackBerry movie, which is based on RIM roughly. But the prototype looked much more polished than the hack that was in the movie. And also, not like in the movie, it was Mike that was in charge, not Jim. We started selling that device in quantity in 1997, and really it could only do text emails and not hugely long text emails. But compared to pagers, which were still a thing at the time, you could send messages both ways and quickly. You could just type in a message and send it to someone's email and they could email you back. That was like a new thing. And also in 1997, we started working on this new piece of hardware which was smaller, more robust, and more powerful compared to the previous one. It actually had a 16 megahertz 386 processor on it. So powerful. And because we did our own RF and DSP and modem and applications and all for it, it was all very tightly integrated and made for a smaller, cheaper unit that used less power, so longer battery life. And the technology at the time still wasn't all that stable yet, so having control over the whole stack was a competitive advantage. Then in 1998 came the thing that really made BlackBerry BlackBerry, which was integration with your corporate email. So this thing no longer had its own email address, but was just a window into your company's email. So if you sent something from this device, it would actually show up in your sent items on your Microsoft Outlook. And if somebody sent you an email, it was in your main inbox, but you could also read it and mark it read or even delete it from your BlackBerry. So really it was the email that you took with you, but it wasn't a separate account that you had to worry about, because with the previous one that became very quickly obvious that it's like, well, which one was it sent to, that sort of thing. And it was also highly encrypted end-to-end, which really helped with corporate IT departments because, of course, they weren't willing to trust sending their secret emails over wireless. Now, getting that sort of thing to just work was a big project that involved a whole lot of pieces. So the way this initially worked, you would have a client company or organization that had their own exchange server for their corporate email. And if they wanted to have BlackBerry for their users, they would set up a BlackBerry Enterprise server that would be bought from RIM. And that connected over the internet to some servers at RIM, which later became the Network Operations Center. And that in turn would send data over an X25 link, that is not internet, into the Mobitex network. And the Mobitex network used small 500 byte packets called MPACs. And these were sent over the wireless network to the actual BlackBerry, which the company provided to the user, bought from RIM, of course. So if an email was received, the enterprise server would immediately get that out of the exchange server, send it over the internet through the BlackBerry Network Operations Center, over here, over the wireless network, and onto the BlackBerry, so that the BlackBerry could start blinking or vibrating as soon as the email was received. And that was a new sort of thing at the time, because other mobile internet email solutions just relied on you saying, okay, get my emails now. Whereas this thing got the email right away without you having to ask for it. And because this network was very slow and insecure, the BlackBerry Exchange server would compress the data using a Burroughs-Wheeler transform, which was a new sort of thing and very good compression for text, and then encrypt it using electrical curve key exchange and triple DES encryption, so that it was secure all the way through here. And then this device would decrypt it and decompress it. And we were very miserly about data, so text only. And if the email was a long one, it would only send the first, I don't know, so many hundred words of it. And if you wanted to read more, which typically you wouldn't, you'd click on here saying I want more of it, and it would go back here and fetch more, so that we really didn't waste any data. So this is how it was when BlackBerry was just on Mobitex, and our assumption was that the mobile network was slow, insecure, and unreliable, and we had to deal with that. There was, of course, other mobile networks in the works already at this point, but BlackBerry on Mobitex was there, and this is the thing that people got hooked on. BlackBerry on Mobitex is really what made RIM's name. But then by 1999, GSM mobile phone networks were starting to roll out this GPRS thing, which was basically an add-on to GSM that would allow you to do packet switch data, which is exactly, of course, what you needed for BlackBerry. GSM was wildly successful in Europe, so that basically there was no other cell phones in Europe, and even in North America, GSM was coming in more, so GPRS was very important, and in 1999, RIM started to develop our own BlackBerry product based on GPRS. And for this, we licensed the GSM GPRS protocol stack from a company called TTPcom from the UK, and we licensed that with the source code, and we used a chipset from Analog Devices that this code was meant to run on, and then we tried to mash it all together, and it was all very complicated and quite flaky at first. And because we still had control over the whole protocol stack and applications, we could run all that, basically the wireless modem stuff and the application stuff, on the same processor, plus DSP of course. And that allowed us to have fewer chips compared to competitors, and longer battery life, and just a smaller device, so a competitive advantage there. Now, GPRS at first wasn't overly fast or reliable or secure, so RIM's way of dealing with Mobitex of compression and encryption and being really miserly with data still made a lot of sense. And passing everything through RIM's network operations center also helped, because that way RIM could monitor it, could tell right away when things went wrong, and basically call the right kind of people to get things back up. So our whole architecture still made a lot of sense. Now, the GSM and GPRS specifications documents were rather gigantic, and they were designed to make use of patents that the companies that wrote these specifications held. And the biggest players in this sort of specmanship were the big telecoms: Motorola, Ericsson, Nokia, Siemens, collectively known as the Men's Club. And Mike Lazaridis really wanted RIM to effectively become part of the Men's Club, to contribute to specifications and be an insider of the telecoms, be like the big telecoms, and also collect royalties when other people built devices. And RIM also could use more connection and that sort of way of doing things. At least that was the thought. So RIM hired a bunch of executives from Motorola, specifically Larry Conley, who then brought in more executives from Motorola. And that whole thing was a bit of a cultural shift for the company, because they wanted to be like a big telecom. This was not something I liked at all. Now, despite trying to become more like these stodgy big telecoms, RIM was still way more nimble than they were. And basically these big telecoms, they just could not come up with good products for the consumer. They couldn't move fast enough. They just weren't in that space to come up with a good mobile device like BlackBerry. So there's never anything that really threatened RIM from those companies, although lots of stuff announced here and there. And we stuck with the physical keyboard, because it turns out that was a so much better way of inputting text compared to other touchscreen approaches that were out there, like the graffiti on the Palm Pilot. Just to type on a physical keyboard, just way better. And for a device that is communications and email centric, being able to type fast really mattered. Now, by 2006, BlackBerry was selling really well, but personally I wasn't really happy with the culture shift, and I felt it was time to move on. So I sent a resume to Google, and they flew me down to the Googleplex in Mountain View, California, and I was interviewed by the Android team because I had experience for that sort of thing. And at the time, this was not public information yet. I didn't know that they were working on something like that. And they said, well, we have to work on some kind of mobile handheld sort of thing because Apple is working on it, so we can't be left behind. And I was kind of like, oh shit. I had previously speculated that the only companies that could kill us had to be very agile and billion-dollar companies. So the startups just weren't well enough capitalized to build a mobile device with all the time that it took. And the big telecom companies were just too slow moving to be really a competitor in that space. So that basically just left Apple and Google as threats. And now they're both working on it. Oh shit. So I was still working at RIM, so I talked to Mike last week and said, do you know that Apple's working on this and Google's working on this? It's like, oh shit. And he's like, have you seen the latest sales figures? Because BlackBerry was like selling really well. I think this is what we were approaching peak BlackBerry at that time. And in retrospect, I can't really blame him so much for not taking that threat seriously, because there have been so many products announced that were going to be a RIM killer that in the end never really amounted to much. So how is this going to be any different, right? Well, it was. So actually iPhone was announced later that year and shipped in 2007, and Android launched in 2008. And unlike RIM, neither Apple nor Google actually designed their own radio modem or radio modem firmware. They just licensed it from chipset vendors, specifically such as Qualcomm. And by then, the technology was stable enough that that approach actually made sense. By that time, the networks were faster and more reliable, so these iPhones and Android phones, they didn't need to go through BlackBerry Enterprise Server and NOC and all that. Basically, the consumer device would connect straight to your internet service provider or to Gmail and download your emails that way. And yeah, it wasn't as secure, it wasn't as efficient, but it worked, and the consumers didn't care because the networks were fast enough. Now, the corporations that had their BlackBerry Enterprise Server set up still very much preferred the BlackBerry because they trusted it and it was more secure. But the actual employees at the corporations wanted sexier devices like an iPhone with a big touchscreen and all that. And so RIM realized that a big touchscreen was important, but the core BlackBerry users loved their keyboard and you couldn't take that away. So there's various compromise solutions that were tried, like the BlackBerry Storm with a clickety screen, which never really worked very well, or a slide-out keyboard. But fundamentally, the keyboard and the big screen were in conflict with each other. In the meantime, the input method on Android and on iPhone was actually a keyboard on the screen, so the keyboard had in fact won. It just didn't really need to be a physical keyboard like it was on a BlackBerry. So here's what I think were BlackBerry's advantage up to this point. The keyboard, but the touchscreens were just more sexy for web browsing and such, and typing on a touchscreen had actually gotten quite good, partially through essentially predictive figuring out what you actually meant to type if you actually missed the right keys. End-to-end compression, that was very useful for saving bandwidth, but the networks were fast enough and the consumers weren't monitoring how much bandwidth they were using, so it didn't really matter that much. End-to-end encryption, the corporations cared about that a lot. Consumers didn't care about that. Plus the networks already provided some fairly secure encryption over the air, so to the consumer it didn't matter. Monitoring of systems through the NOC and basically alerting various people that things need to be fixed, that was an asset when everything was flaky, but there was a few well-publicized times when the NOC went down, which means all the BlackBerries didn't work, and every time that happened, that was a big news event because there's still a lot of very important people using BlackBerry. So the NOC actually added unreliability as opposed to reliability. Tight integration by doing it ourselves so that we could use fewer chips and such, but all the chipsets that came out at this point had a separate processor for the applications. So a processor to run the Android or iOS and the other processor to run the firmware stack for the radio that the chipset vendor provided. So our ability to run everything on one processor didn't matter so much anymore. And push notification of email, that wasn't something everybody had. On a BlackBerry, your email just arrived and it could buzz or beep or whatever you wanted, whereas a lot of rival products, you still had to kind of click on something, go fetch emails. But that was changing. Other devices could do push notification in their ways as well, so that was also no longer a BlackBerry sort of thing. With the radio part that handled the GSM, GPRS, Edge, 3G, etc. being a component that Apple and Google could just buy, their focus was more on the operating system and a rich suite of applications to provide a really nice user experience, because that's something that they were always focused on from either Apple computers or the web. In the meantime, RIM or BlackBerry was still using its own homegrown OS, and it just wasn't keeping up with the expectations that Apple and Google had created of what a mobile device should be able to do. So RIM ended up buying this Canadian company called QNX that produced a mobile operating system that was more Unix-like. It was a small Ottawa company, so it was relatively easy to buy. And a mad scramble happened to basically try to integrate all that. Basically, the company was treated more as an HR hire. RIM didn't really care about the existing QNX business. They just wanted the technology and the people to make a better BlackBerry. But Apple and Google, of course, they didn't sit still either, and they kept on innovating. So it was a moving target, and over time, the applications became a more and more important thing. And being the third player that is incompatible was, of course, not great. So RIM added the ability for BlackBerries to run Android applications. But then, okay, if your goal is to run Android applications, wouldn't it make much more sense to just buy an Android device instead of a BlackBerry? Of course, there were still diehard BlackBerry fans who loved their keyboard, loved their security and all that. But overall, RIM was just getting outcompeted, and the bottom end usually ends up eating the top end. RIM was the more expensive corporate sort of solution, and with the consumers all buying lots of Androids and iOS devices, well, they just got better and better, and they could do basically pretty much all the things that BlackBerry was needed for. So BlackBerry just gradually got pushed out of the market. They got outcompeted. So now the question is, where did RIM or BlackBerry go wrong? Well, aiming to become like a big telecom company wasn't helpful when suddenly you have large and nimble competitors. And look at the companies RIM was trying to emulate: Motorola, Ericsson, Nokia, Siemens. None of those companies lasted in the handset space. They just weren't able to move fast enough. Mike wanted RIM to just turn into an established big company that reliably ships product, more focused on delivering instead of constantly innovating and all that like some unstable startup. And that would have probably worked out if Apple and Google hadn't entered the market. But then with them in there and other competitors, innovation was key just to stay in the game. Of course, there was other distractions for upper management. There was, for instance, the NTP lawsuit, which went on from around 2004 to 2006, and RIM got taken to the cleaners for $450 million over a bogus patent. There was the backdating scandal, which broke, I think, in early 2007 and got settled in 2009. That caused a rift between Mike Lazaridis and Jim Balsley, which also didn't help. And then there's other distractions. So, for instance, Mike Lazaridis founded the Perimeter Institute for Quantum Physics and such in 1999, and he was also a chancellor for University of Waterloo from 2003 to 2009. Jim Balsley, not to be outdone, he started the Center for International Governance Innovation in 2001. He was also trying to buy the Pittsburgh Penguins in 2006, but I don't think that was the first time he tried to buy a hockey team. And he was also very active in buying golf courses, so plenty of distractions there too. But distractions themselves don't kill a company, they only make it less responsive. And I've been playing this thought experiment. What if I could go back in time to any time and magically be able to persuade upper management to change the direction of the company? What would I do and when? In retrospect, RIM needed to start a new effort based on a real operating system years sooner, so that by the time iPhone and Android came around, RIM would have had an equally sophisticated offering by then. But this sort of effort takes years, so we would have had to start that at least 5 years before 2010. And researching this a bit, Apple began efforts for iPhone in 2004, but they based it on basically their Mac OS X, and so they didn't exactly start from scratch. They already had a lot of experience with that. Google bought Android in 2005, but Android already was a mobile OS by then. So here, for example, is the Danger HipTop from 2002, and that ran a precursor of Android. So basically, Android was already a mobile OS by 2002. So I would say RIM would have had to switch focus to a new operating system, ditch the keyboard, ditch the things that make BlackBerry great by no later than, I would say, 2003. But that was right around the time that BlackBerry was really taking off. We had our hands full with the success of BlackBerry. There's no way the company would have abandoned what worked so well at the time. So we would have had to hire a new team to do the new thing in parallel. But so many great engineers would not be found at Waterloo in such a short time. It's not like Silicon Valley where people move around all the time. And even if such a great team could be found, without focus from the top, without a clearly defined problem, I don't see this going the right way. You can't just throw money and people at a problem and expect it to go well. I mean, think of all of these government IT software procurement disasters. It just would have turned into one of those. And even if the executive had this vision to focus on this new approach, to divert the company's focus away from what was so successful at the time, that would have been hard to justify. And the solution that we had, say around 2003, was pretty good for the time. But what if we started with a more advanced OS in the first place? Well, then the BlackBerry would have needed bigger, more expensive hardware, would have shipped much later because it would have taken longer, and would have had worse battery life, and likely would have missed its golden market opportunity. And I was one of the people at fault for this because back in 1997, when we started development of the OS for this thing, I kept saying, it's a pager, damn it, because that's the space it was competing in. So I guess what you really needed to develop this new, more advanced mobile operating system and apps was a separate team with separate leadership that cares primarily about that. And the best way to achieve that if it's done in a different organization entirely. And that's exactly what happened, because that new, better mobile OS was developed at Apple and at Google, different organizations, just wasn't RIM. But as time went on, it was no longer a matter of just the mobile operating system. You also needed an app store and all that goes with it, and a way of organizing your photos and your own mapping service, and a great web browser, and a way of having podcasts hosted, and video conferencing capability. Apple and Google are both able to leverage their strengths in the computing industry, so even if RIM had the more sophisticated OS at the right time, it would have still been very hard to keep up. So if I could magically go back and change RIM's direction and focus in the past, I still don't think I would be able to save it. In retrospect, I think RIM may have been doomed as far back as 2003 due to Apple and Google, well before BlackBerry actually really took off. And the thing is, when a company has something that worked well for a long time and is still more profitable than the alternative, you stick with it until it's too late. Think of WordPerfect versus Microsoft Word, or Sun Microsystems getting clobbered by Linux, or the record industry still selling shrink-wrapped CDs as opposed to going to online delivery, or newspapers versus Craigslist. It just happens time and time again. So yeah, looking back, I don't see how this could have gone well. The inevitable could have been postponed a bit longer with better focus and better direction perhaps, but I don't think it could have been saved against the juggernauts. And as for me, leaving RIM in 2007 I think was one of the best decisions I ever made. And working on this video, I dug up some of my old Blackberries I still have from back in the day. So this is the original BlackBerry and has a nice and wide keyboard, and we all got really fast at typing on these things. I think 40 words per minute on this thing was pretty typical, but just black and white, no camera or anything like that. This one is a BlackBerry Pearl, and it only has half as many keys as letter, but basically just use predictive sort of typing to figure out what you meant to type, even though it only has half as many keys as letters. Sort of like the T9 predictive typing, but better because it's got more keys than that. And the nice thing about this is it's small, it's really pocketable. Not like today's gigantic phones. Of course, no YouTube or scrolling through social media on that one, but maybe that was a feature.